I have been playing jazz piano for about 15 years now, and through all that time, I was never really taught how to comp for a bass player. If you want to play jazz piano trio as a leader, you're probably going to be doing a lot of bass comping, so I can't stress enough how important it is to know how to comp for the bass and how to comp effectively for the bass. You'll make your bassist more happy about your playing, and you'll be able to make your entire performance be a cohesive piece of music rather than feeling like, here's my piano solo, and then the bass solo just kind of falls flat because you don't know how to support him or her. So in this video, I'm going to be covering 2 things that kill your comping for bass players, and then 4 ways that you can fix them so that you can become a more supportive pianist and collaborator within your ensembles. And in order to accomplish this, we're actually going to be looking at my comping on a recent concert that I had with Henry Beale and Quincy Davis. So we're going to be looking at what makes this comping work, and then 4 ways that we can combat those 2 killers that we're going to talk about so that we can understand how comping should actually be done for a bass player. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, number 1 is probably fairly obvious because as pianists, we are often told not to play in the bass register, and that is mostly true. And I want to cover why people tell you that and why it's mostly true and why it's partially not true. The thing that you need to understand about piano and bass in the same register is that the bass has a very transparent texture. What that means is that if you play the same note in both the piano and the bass, the piano will overpower the bass. It's also why if you've ever heard a piano do walking bass, it's really not all that satisfying because the timbre of the piano in that bass register is just huge. It is big in a different way than the bass, in kind of an unsatisfying way. So if you have the piano and the bass in the same register, the piano will always overpower the bass. Now, that doesn't mean that you can never play low notes or that you can never play in the bass register. But what it does mean is that if you do play in the bass register, you need to be careful. Playing in the bass register as a pianist, comping for a bass solo, takes a lot of careful listening, and it takes a lot of nuance to understand what is going to get in the way and what isn't going to get in the way. So I generally recommend for beginners to stay out of the bass register until you know that you are comfortable enough to really be listening to the bass. In junior high and high school, I lived in the same neighborhood as a local keyboardist named Michael Huff. He's actually known much more for his choral conducting, his choral arranging, but he was playing in a cover band that was really popular in Salt Lake City. And so oftentimes I would go to his gigs. He would let me sit in occasionally. And I remember one of the first times he let me sit in, he kept on slapping my left hand, telling me to get out of the bass register. And that was kind of the first time that I had been told, stay out of the bass register, because I was getting in the way of the bass player. So the first killer is probably the most common thing that you're told as a pianist when you're playing for a bass player, but the second thing is almost worse. And what that is playing timidly. And really, this is an overcorrection from number 1. Because you've been told that you can't play in the bass register, that you're going to get in the way of the bassist, what ends up happening is that you just play timidly. You're probably not comfortable swinging at a really soft volume. You're really afraid that you're going to step on the bass player. And so what usually happens with young jazz pianists is that they stop playing in the bass register, but instead of really developing skills to feel confident comping for bass, they end up overcorrecting, playing too softly, and not playing with good time. And when you play too softly, you play only in the high register, or you stop playing altogether, the bassist is going to get pretty upset. And so you may have heard this before from a bass player who gets a little frustrated saying, I supported the band for 90% of the tune, and then finally we get to the bass solo, and you're not supporting me. why does everybody lay out when it comes to the bass solo? Why does the bass solo suck? Not because the bass player sucks, but because the band doesn't know how to support a bass player. So there is some general advice that I've gotten from bassist Lynn Seaton, who's the bass professor at the University of North Texas, and he usually says that when you're comping for a bass player, you should play the exact same way that you would play for anyone else, except for play at a quarter of the volume. And I actually think this is good advice, but in practice, a lot of times it kind of reinforces this timidity or feeling like you have to kind of apologize for your playing when you're playing with a bass player. So we're going to tackle 4 ways that you can figure out how to straddle the line between these 2 killers of bass comping and how you can actually become a more effective comper for bass solos. And in order to do that, I'm going to be using a recording from a recent concert that I had at the Windmills Craftworks in the Colony, Texas, where I was playing with Henry Beale and Quincy Davis. So go ahead and listen to this. And as you're listening, I want you to be thinking about 2 things: register and articulation. The register of the piano and the register of the bass and how they interact. And then articulation, short or long notes between the bass, piano, and the drums. So I know that I asked you to think about register and articulation while you were listening to that, but the first way that we are going to fix our bass comping is by playing rhythmic phrases. Now, you probably know some very simple rhythmic phrases, such as the Charleston rhythm. So this is a very standard rhythmic phrase. It's a 1-measure rhythmic phrase, and it's just something that repeats so that the soloist knows what to expect, but also so that the listener doesn't get distracted by what you're playing. A lot of times when we're talking about getting in the bass player's way, a lot of times what happens is that our playing is just unpredictable. So there are a lot of simple rhythms that you can use to get started playing rhythmic phrases, such as playing the Charleston or playing the Red Garland pattern. But what I want you to think about most clearly is that when we are comping for the bass player, we don't want our rhythms to be all over the place. We want to be able to use repetitive rhythms that clearly support the soloist. So even as we look at this top line of comping for the bass soloing, there are a lot of places where I repeated rhythms, and these are clear rhythmic phrases. Even right here, I'm using a lot of what's called the Red Garland pattern. Essentially, what you need to do when you're comping for a bass player is don't forget about playing really clear rhythmic phrases. Make sure that you are playing very clearly. And when you do play with clear rhythmic phrasing, your comping will sink into the background and not get in the way. You'll be able to make your playing more transparent, even though you're playing supportive, you're playing full chords, and you're not skimping in terms of support for the bassist. The second thing is a concept that I call stitching. Now, when we think about playing phrases, sometimes we think about playing a 4-measure phrase like we would when we're soloing. Like this would be a 4-measure phrase if you are soloing. Right, so that's a 4-measure phrase if we're soloing, but if we're comping, we actually need to have a type of phrasing that is mostly playing in the gaps, and that's essentially what I'm doing when I comp. Instead of playing ideas that are in the middle of 2 and 4 measure sections, I'm actually playing ideas that are between and at the end of these 2 and 4 measure sections. Let's take a little bit of a listen again and see how I tend to play ideas in the cracks instead of playing ideas that would be in the way of the bass player. So notice how I'm playing at the middle of the phrases or at the ends of the phrases rather than in the middle of the phrase. Now I'm doing some long notes, now some repetitive rhythms. So the main thing to notice here is just this concept of stitching, that rather than playing in the middle of the phrases, playing phrases that are getting in the way, I'm playing things at the ends of the phrases to fill in a very unobtrusive manner. And because I'm playing in this way, I can actually play at full volume or half volume instead of the quarter volume or less that Lynn Seaton was referring to earlier when we were talking about not getting in the way of the bassist. So the third way we want to fix our comping is by focusing on melody. Now this may seem a little bit counterintuitive because usually when we're thinking about comping, we want to not play too melodically, or rather we don't want to play something that might be construed as a solo. After all, we are comping for the bassist. If we play something that's too active or too melodic, we might get in the way of the bassist. But rather than thinking about our melodies in terms of eighth notes and quarter notes, think about your melodies as things that span an entire 4 measures. You might only play a few different notes in the span of 4 or 8 measures, but still you should always be thinking about the tops of your lines as being melodies. So listen once more to my comping and try to hear that the tops of my chords always are trying to be melodies. Even if they're repeated notes, they're always trying to be melodic. So notice this line starting from the D minor 7 where I'm going. Right? Even though this is a very simple line, I'm just going down by step. What it does when I have simple phrases like this that just connect the dots between the chords, what it does is it just makes everything feel more cohesive. It gives the bass player a much more clear bed to be able to play on top of, rather than just feeling like they're playing on something that's not very musical. So focusing on melody in all of your comping is going to fix how supportive you can be, and you can play very quietly or even louder and still not get in the way and be supportive of your soloist. And the last thing I want to talk about is listening. Now, when I had you listen the first time, I told you that I wanted you to focus on register and articulation. And the reason I had you listen for those things is I hope that you noticed that over the course of that recording or that bass solo, there were some small changes that happened. There was a point where Henry went up in register, and I reacted to that. There were some places where he went back down, and I did the opposite. You'll actually notice some places where he goes up in register and I go down, and then we go back. Let's listen to a little bit of that. So he starts to go up in register. He's climbing, and I start going down. And I'm now starting to hear that he's going down in register, so I'm going to move my way up. Now, what I'm not saying is that when the bass player goes up, you should go down and vice versa. But what I am saying is that when I choose to go in the bass register, I am listening very clearly to the register. Sometimes when we're told to listen to others when they're playing their solos, what we tend to think is that we need to think about every phrase and every lick that they play, we need to be ready to jump on. But a lot of times that can just lead to playing that sounds a little bit like Mickey Mousing. What I mean is like almost like you're mimicking them, or they start playing short notes and you start playing short notes. That's not what I'm saying. Instead, what you should be listening to are general trends in their playing. There's one moment in this solo where the texture shifts and Quincy goes to the hi-hat. Let's listen to that. So Quincy is on his ride, which is long sounds, and then he's going to switch to the hi-hat. And I changed textures as well. So even as I'm doing this, as I'm walking you through some of my choices, in the moment, I wasn't really thinking about that. All I was thinking was something changed. I wasn't even really thinking he went down or he went up. But because I was listening very intently to his playing and thinking about the general contour of his playing, I was able to make decisions that really supported his solo fairly nicely, I'd like to think. So when you're comping for a bass player, here are 4 tools that you can use to make sure that you are both supportive, but not in the way of the bass player. The first one is play clear rhythmic phrases. Second one is think about this concept of stitching, playing in the gaps of their phrases. And if you're going to have any more activity, play it in those gaps rather than in the center of their phrases. That will be a lot less obtrusive and it'll be a lot more supportive. Third is focus on melody. Even if you're playing ideas that, you're playing 1 chord per measure or 2 chords per measure, make sure that you're focusing on having something in your playing, your top line, be melodic. And then the fourth thing is, rather than thinking about listening in terms of something that you have to be intently focused on every single note that they're playing, think about big picture things. Big picture listening, focusing on their articulation, their phrasing, and trying to make changes that support the overall contour of their solo so that you can make it more of a story. And that's a great way that you can solve those 2 killers of bass comping, which is getting in the way of the bass player or playing too timidly. So learning how to comp for basses takes a lot of time. I would say it's probably the last thing I've felt really comfortable with as a pianist, and so it's not going to be something that you're just going to learn how to do and then you'll be fine and never have to focus on it again. But I encourage you to just pick 1 or 2 of these ideas and focus on improving that one when you comp for a bassist. These are definitely skills that take more time to develop. So if you are a beginning or an intermediate jazz pianist who needs a little bit more support getting through some of these growing pains as you start going to your first jam sessions, getting your first gigs, I'm opening up some new spots in my membership, Freedom at the Piano Academy, where we have weekly live classes where you can get feedback from me. I listen to your recordings, as well as a community where you can post your progress and work through the course material that I have available to you. So if you'd like to find out more about that, go ahead and check out the link in the description and you can join the waitlist for when those spots open up. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments what was the biggest takeaway and how you're going to change your bass comping going forward. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.